Hello, everyone. Good day. My name is Dr. Doyin Atewologun. I am CEO and founder of Delta Leadership and Inclusion Consulting. I'm also a psychologist, business advisor, and researcher. And I am thrilled to be here to host this particular Delta Talks episode, which is about psychological safety. And this is part of our Delta Psychological Safety Month. So very excited to have this as part of this. Particularly excited because we're going to be in conversation with experts in psychological safety, and we have a particular take on psychological safety today. Today, we're going to be talking about how psychological safety matters in relation to identities and social groups, and the positive impact or the positive potential this has when we're thinking about psychologically safe cultures in the context of a diverse workforce. I'm about to introduce our speakers today. We have Michael Puchalla, with whom I work, and we also have Viva Asmelash and Agatha Agbanobi, who, as you've just heard, are joining us from the States. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about our phenomenal discussants. So, Michael Puchalla is an MSc positive coaching psychologist and accredited coach. He's one of my dear colleagues at Delta. He's one of our expert coaches and facilitators. We work together in programs for equity and business performance. And Michael's particular expertise is in creating a coaching mindset and culture, building trust across diverse work relationships, and creating high-performing and psychologically safe teams for individuals and in conversation and collaboration with line managers so that these various parties can explore tough topics constructively and without judgment. Welcome, Michael. Viva, such a pleasure to have you. Viva Asmelash is a consultant and speaker who specializes in inclusive learning experiences, strategic planning, overall employee well-being, and culturally aware feedback training. As the co-founder of Liberation Labs, Viva is laser-focused on helping mission-driven teams engage in more equitable, meaningful, and joyful work. Liberation Labs is not your typical consulting partner. Rather, they work to push past siloed diversity, equality, and inclusion conversations to show select clients why and how to weave principles of equity and inclusion into the very fabric of their organization in tangible ways. And a very special welcome to Agatha Agbanobi, who is the founder of Relevé, a consulting and advisory firm that helps teams build, improve, and sustain their diversity, equity, inclusion, and worker well-being strategy with data-driven coaching programs such as Inclusive Equity in Action Leadership and the Race of Psychological Safety. The latter focuses on the psychological safety gap between white people and people of color in the workplace. Agatha specializes in custom, fit-for-purpose diversity, equity, and inclusion training programs, audit assessments, strategic planning, as well as program design and sustainability through her firm. She's also a diversity, equity, and inclusion and human resources instructor at Cornell University. And she has another forthcoming article about colorism and allyship in the workplace with the Harvard Business Review. These are the people with whom to have this conversation. And so I'm just going to say a little by way of how we came together, and then we're going to launch into it. So like I said, today's about identity matters and why identities matter in psychological safety. So how did we get here? How did four of us come to this conversation? Michael and I and other team members at Delta, as I mentioned before, we've been working in talent and organizational development programs. And we've been working to help clients increase retention and belonging and innovation through psychological safety. And then because our work is evidence-based, we are always on the lookout for new ideas, innovations, research to help apply to clients, and came across this fantastic article. Luke, our colleague, is going to put the article in the chat very shortly. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to hand over to Michael to start the conversation. Let's first kick off with what psychological safety at work is.
Yes, I'm really excited about this conversation, and so that Viva and Agatha, you both could join, and Doyin as well. And let me start to answer the question, what is psychological safety? And I think when we talk about psychological safety, we do need to think or mention Amy Edmondson, who coined the term psychological safety, who is a Harvard Business School professor. And she defines it as the following, and I have written it down, so I will read it out. So it's a shared belief that the team or group we are part of is safe for interpersonal risk-taking without the fear of negative consequences to the self, image, the status, or our career. And that's quite an important part. So there's no fear of negative consequences to the self-image, the status, or our career. And I want to talk a bit more about interpersonal risk-taking, because that will be important to highlight when we're talking about psychological safety. So in its most simple form, we can think about every action or communication or interaction we do or we engage in at work as carrying a certain risk. So carrying a certain risk to our social or personal standing within our team or the organization. So when we're thinking about actions, could mean, writing an email to our colleagues, to a client, could be sharing an idea with the team, or speaking up in a team meeting, or speaking up about something that we don't agree with, giving feedback, presenting, or as something bringing yourself to work. And I like how Timothy Clark breaks psychological safety down. So it's another great leading figure when it comes to psychological research. And he breaks it down into 4 different work cultures, which helps to make a better sense of it. So the first one is inclusion. So can all or everybody or all team members feel valued, respected, supported, and included? The second level he talks about is, do all team members feel safe to ask questions or even admit to mistakes and challenges and learn from them? Another culture is contributing, which kind of asks around, does everybody feel empowered to contribute their expertise, their ideas, their perspectives, and are having the ability to take initiative? The last one is challenging. So do all team members feel safe to voice their opinion, share feedback openly, and are able to disagree? So challenge the status quo. So that is something that describes, psychological safety, or defines it in various different forms. So for me, when I combine all of that, the core message is there's a sense of confidence, of trust, that we are heard and valued at work. So and as Doyin mentioned, when I came across Agatha's and Viva's article, this is one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading, how psychological safety can be cultivated for Black women in your work organization or in your company. And that's what stood out. There was a much more nuanced conversation around that part. And it was highlighting the fact that our identities actually matter when it comes to cultivating psychological safety. And that is something that we don't often come across. Often when we're talking or reading about psychological safety, assumption is that to create it's the same for everybody, but that's not the case. So I'm so pleased when I reached out to Viva and Agatha that they responded and were open to join. So maybe Viva, I want to ask you actually, so what inspired you to write this article with Agatha together?
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, let me say I'm just so happy to be here with all of you and be in community. These are conversations that I think don't happen nearly as often as they should. So excited to be here with my dear friend and co-author Agatha. Sure. So what inspired us to write this article? I think the best place to start is to say that, often there are these concepts that surface in the workplace and start to gain attention from dominant groups, right? And those of us who hold marginalized identities can often struggle to see our own stories or lenses incorporated into that sort of mainstream dialogue. And part of why that's important is that mainstream dialogue is what ultimately informs change in these places where at this point anyway, we have to exist and sometimes we get to exist. So a couple of examples of that might be, Brene Brown's work on vulnerability, or, Sheryl Sandberg's book, When Lean In was published, right? These are a couple of examples of times where at least many of the Black women that I know and others from marginalized groups were saying, where are we in this conversation? And there are pieces of this that are missing that are pertinent to the context that applies to us, right? And so because Agatha and I were connected on LinkedIn, we found that we were asking similar questions when it came to psychological safety, right? Where is this distinctive conversation for Black women and for those of us who have been historically excluded? And so let me just say that we can, this is where it's like both and, right? We can respect the efforts of these works and at the same time, really be asking questions about how they are relevant to our experiences, and also ensuring that the ancestral traditions that precede these works, right, and might inform these works are not lost in the dialogue too. So those were a couple of things that we wanted to do. And Agatha and I it's exciting for us to be here because this is also just purely just a labor of love. We felt really compelled to write this. And we had two primary outcomes when we were doing so. First and foremost, to validate the experiences of Black women and to say, you are seen, you are understood, and you are not imagining what is happening to you in the workplace when it comes to this conversation. And secondly, with organizations, right, to really provide first of all, to provide the proper context. So there's that understanding, right? And then to provide some really concrete actions that they could take to nurture these efforts within their teams in new ways, right? The last thing I'll say about this, I could talk about Agatha and our work together all day long, but I will just say that no group is a monolith, right? Black women included. And so while we had a lot of shared experiences that informed this work, we also found along the way that we had really distinctive strengths that I think ultimately really made this piece that much stronger. So yeah, those were a handful of things that inspired us.
Thank you so much, Viva, for sharing. That's inspiring, and especially of bringing together, your strengths bringing a much more nuanced conversation, when it comes to psychological safety. So, and I want to actually ask you, Agatha, since I provided a more general definition of psychological safety, how would you describe psychological safety as you outlined it in your article?
Yeah, I would first and foremost define psychological safety as the level of safety that everyone feels psychologically, regardless of their identity. And I think that while there are folks who have laid the foundation, right, of that initial definition of what it could be, or it should be, right? We have to understand the reality of the fact that everyone is arriving to the workplace with different lived experiences because of their identity. And more so, if they have identities that are historically and presently marginalized, right, on a daily basis. And oftentimes what that causes, right, for us, for example, Black women, is that we have a heightened level of apprehension when we're entering the workplace. And so I think that there potentially were some assumptions made or being made by folks who have been leading the conversation on psychological safety. I think one of those assumptions was that being included automatically meant that folks would feel safe. Like, just thinking about the first level of the psychological safety that Timothy Clark has laid out. And my response to that, or reaction to that, is that while there is great intent behind inclusion, we need organizations to be working more deeply to develop an equity-centered culture in policy and practice, with the right accountability systems to uphold it, right? So that we aren't inviting people in already at different levels of state of trauma, potentially, because identity-based harm on a systemic and routine basis can cause trauma. To really help leaders understand that it's not just about inviting folks in, but it's also about laying the foundation, developing, setting up a culture and an environment that makes people feel like they can trust the invitation that's being handed out to them, right? And the last thing I'll say is that what has largely been missing in these conversations too is the depth of understanding of how systemic oppression works across different levels of marginalization, and how that then requires us to be trauma informed in our approach to practice and policy reform, or even redesign, right? So, for example, understanding the level of resistance one faces for existing as they are, the inordinate amount of energy that they are employing at work just to do their job, right? So not even thinking about, contributing their ideas in a group setting just quite yet, or even challenging the status quo. Understanding the amount of energy that actually takes on top of doing their job is really, really important, so that organizations can begin to see how can they begin to support different workers, so they aren't having to expend that much energy, right? And a good example is just communication and interactions, right? I think there are a lot of leaders out there who may not know how to communicate with different people from different backgrounds, who have different communication styles, right? Regardless of their identity. And when just on that level, and then when you bring identity on top of that, the level threat potentially of being able to speak honestly, that takes a toll on someone, having to play mental gymnastics on top of solving the problems of the job. So I would say that overall, it's really important that we ask ourselves, what are some assumptions we might be making when we're defining these terms about how different people are showing up to the workplace, and then how might the support that we are providing people be a bit more nuanced and differentiated, so that we're not providing some one size fits all solution, even in this realm of work of psychological safety.
There's so much in there. Thank you so much, both Viva and Agatha, and Michael. So what has happened so far is we've heard Michael describe psychological safety from some of the more prominent authors, some of the ones that are quite regularly cited. And then we've also had the opportunity to hear from Viva and Agatha in terms of, well, actually, when we think about some of these kind of big concepts that become quite popular, become quite compelling at work, well, actually, we need to think, like Agatha said, what are the assumptions we're making about the extent to which this works for everyone? And so one of the things that I'm taking from the conversation so far is, for example, when we think about different identities, so Agatha, you've spoken a little to the ways in which energetically, like our just everyday experience at work, energetically could differ. And therefore, the extent to which I feel I even have the energy to, put my hand up and say, this is what I'm experiencing, that's important. And I think I would love, while we're moving the conversation into the implications for the workplace, would love maybe one or two examples, maybe one example from each of you in terms of like some of the assumptions that Agatha has made, just to bring it to life a little bit more, like a specific illustration where, for example, X might show up in this way, and that gives them permission or makes it permissible for psychological safety to be experienced, for lack of a better word. But this same counterpart, because of their identity, would not have the exact same experience, and businesses need to think differently. So if you can just pull out one or two examples to bring it alive, that would be really great. Yeah. Agatha, can I kick off? Oh, Viva, did you want to give that?
I was just going to say, this isn't a specific example. I can definitely offer many, but one thing I want to, because I think it helps to illustrate for people what we're really talking about here is like, a lot of times people think, well, and Agatha was alluding to this, like, our organization is inclusive, right? We do our best here. But the other assumption that people are making is that everybody walks through the doors of that organization starting off with the same degree of psychological safety, or if we're talking about Timothy Clark's work, in the same stage of psychological safety, right? But if you think about, someone from a dominant group, a white male, for example, going through their entire life, through school and every classroom, and sharing a different perspective and being told, good on you for having a different perspective, good on you for thinking outside the box, well done, way to be creative, right? Whereas someone like me, a Black woman, or somebody else with a marginalized identity might be told, you're not sticking to the outline here. You're not sticking to the lesson that I've laid out for you. And if I push back, right, then there may be even sometimes all of these disciplinary actions that might follow, right? So we have to really understand that when people are even coming to us initially, yes, we want to make sure that we're tending to the environment that we're creating, but also with the understanding and knowledge that when people even come to us, they're coming to us not free of all of those other things that have informed their experience or their degree of safety.
Thanks, Viva. Great. Agatha, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for adding that. Essentially, yeah, we're not all starting off at the same level, and that really gets at equity again, right? It's leveling that playing field. And so whenever I often think that whenever we are doing this work, we need to be starting with equity and not with inclusion or even diversity. I believe that diversity and inclusion are the outcomes of equity-centered practices.
How would you define, Agatha, sorry to interrupt, how would you define equity for our listeners?
Yeah, I would define equity as, especially because I think it often gets confused or used interchangeably with equality. I would define equity as the recognition of the fact that our systems are unequal. That just by virtue of the structures and systems that we live in as individuals in our society, that the playing field is not the same. And so what might take 5 steps for a white man to get to one goal, it might take a Black woman 20 steps or 25 steps, right? A really quick example is mentorship, for example, or even sponsorship in the workplace. There are a lot of leaders who often subconsciously or consciously identify emerging leaders who look like them, right? Who talk like them, have the same mannerisms as them as they do. And so let's say, Tom, a white man, is an emerging leader. He's not going to have to do as much and navigate as much, right? And be as strategic about getting the attention of maybe a majority dominant group leadership within the organization, right? A Black woman is going to have to do so much more in and outside of the workplace to build that social capital, build that trust mutually, and so forth. So that's one quick example in that way for equity.
Thank you both for those examples that really help bring it alive, but also, I guess, brings to our attention the inequitable spaces that we find ourselves in, right? We show up at work, or we build these organizations, and some of us less informed than others in terms of the ways in which the established processes or systems, like, find a mentor, just get feedback, just get on the right project, like those things have different implications. Well, different types of people have different opportunities to have access to those resources. And, I think what I wanted to do, let's just, continue to think about how identity matters in when we think about creating psychological safe spaces at work. One of the things that we do, and that has kind of seemed so powerful with the clients that we work with, is really lead into that idea that different people have experiences linked to these social groups, social identities. So on the call so far, we've talked about gender, we've talked about ethnicity, as Black women, but there's also, of course, so many others. There's class, there's disability, there's sexual orientation, there's religion, and all of these have, in terms of the world we find ourselves, all of these have different values where, if you're in one side or one end, you're kind of, closer to the dominant group. And if you're in the other end, you don't. And so one of the sessions that's coming to mind as I'm thinking about our conversation that we've done with line managers, and you talked about sponsors, as well as people who self-identify as minoritized ethnic professionals. We've more or less just said, let's all kind of just get into a space, come in one space. And then we've asked people to get into different groups, kind of like all of the early career professionals who belong to minority ethnic groups. You go into one area and just have a conversation about what a psychological safe culture would look like for you. And then we get the sponsors, the line managers, many of whom are white and belong to more upper and middle class backgrounds. All right, you have a think about what psychological safety means in your in your neck of the woods. And then we surface the different definitions or the different practices, and then ask everyone to kind of come together and say, okay, let's map out a zone of psychological safety. Right? What are the practices that are in that zone that will help you bring all of yourself, bring the most appropriate part of yourself, the fullness that you want to bring to work, and what are the things that you don't want? And, we hear things like, well, you know what, in my experience, when I disagree, I've been excluded. That I don't, that's out of the circle. In my experience, people don't, pronounce my name properly, and then don't ask me how to pronounce my name properly. That's out of the circle. But actually, permission to ask my name, permission to ask for my name, how to pronounce it, permission to be listened to. I mean, all of those things are part of creating, kind of co-creating psychologically safe spaces. And so, I just love that this is providing our listeners with some, examples of ways in which this is kind of pertinent in the workplace. But I think so far our conversation has been, or the dialogue has been, the impact specifically for people who belong to minoritized or marginalized groups. And I think it's also important for us to think about the value of psychological safety for individuals who self-identify or who are identified as belonging to dominant or majority social identity groups. And so I just want to pull Michael into the conversation to share some thoughts on why psychological safety as an idea, as a concept, as a practice is important for people who belong to majority social groups. Michael, over to you.
I would just want to come back to one of the things actually, and we haven't mentioned it yet, and that's, when does psychological safety actually exist? And it only exists if everyone, every single person does experience it or agrees. So it's a group. You create a group phenomena. You're creating group norms that makes it acceptable or not acceptable, or safe or unsafe, which creates behaviors or looks at behaviors and practices that creates or cultivates psychological safety within that team or an organization. So when I think about psychological safety further, I want to break it actually a bit further down. So on one hand, psychological safety is beneficial for everybody, beneficial to be at the very, very best. So that means, even when we're talking about dominant or social or majority social identity groups, who are in the dominant or in the majority, that helps too. But on the other hand, I actually want to draw a link to allyship. And when it comes to disrupting barriers to sustainable culture change. So maybe it's important to quickly define what allyship is, or how we talk about allyship. So allyship is, in the essence, someone acknowledges and acts on the personal belief, so on my personal belief that working towards equity is not solely the responsibility of members of historically marginalized groups. It is the work of the dominant group members, which I personally belong to as a white man. So what that means for me is I have to learn, I have to educate myself, I have to speak up, I have to challenge and interrupt systems that are unfavorable, policies and behaviors. And I think the most important part, and Agatha, you have mentioned it earlier, is to understand the energy it requires to feel accepted or to feel part of it. So that means take responsibility. So as an ally, to take responsibility to carry some of that load, to carry that load, that emotional comes from the emotional labor when we're working towards or seeking equity, which marginalized groups carry all the time. So when I think organizations have to think of psychological safety as allyship. These two are like one thing for me that comes together, because it creates an environment to have the open and honest conversations. It welcomes to challenge the status quo and enables people to speak up and to make mistakes. So maybe to make it really concrete, so organizations and leaders and managers, as we have seen, as Doyin you have it outlined before when we do the exercise, we can feel that individuals feel comfortable to share and speak up about their challenges, about their experiences at work. And though on the other hand, and that again is when we then hear that as allies, there is action to be taken. And when you find yourself in an environment where you feel or have the psychological safety, you can disrupt, incredible behaviors and systems. You take action. You can feel or be in a space where it's okay to make mistakes and learn from them. So again, it comes back to psychological safety. And I think recently, Doyin, let me draw that to this bit. When we looked, Doyin and a colleague of mine, Benke and I, we wrote a book chapter on inclusive coaching. And in the book, we highlighted some of the research findings that we found when it came to creating an inclusive culture change and how inclusive coaching can support that. And one of the biggest findings that we found was that for allies in the coaching space, they were talking about the fear of getting it wrong when it came to taking action. So again, that comes back to psychological safety. So Doyin, that's how I see that importance of psychological safety for dominant group members.
Interesting. Thanks, Michael. Well, I'd love to hear Viva and Agatha's responses to that, because on one hand, we're saying, the heart of their article is the need to critically consider psychological safety from the perspective of African American women. Like that's the core message in that current article that we're discussing. And now we're thinking about, well, what are the implications for when we think about identity matters for majority and more kind of dominant group members? And that's where the conversation is now. So we'd just love to invite, maybe I'll kick off with Viva. Just what are some of your reflections in terms of what's resonating, what's landing, what points you want to reiterate for our colleagues listening?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you, Michael, for bringing up allyship. I saw actually somebody in the chat had a great contribution in saying allyship isn't just a fancy badge, it's a responsibility to speak up, speak out, and share the burden, which I really appreciate. And we all, in different ways, are aspiring allies, right? I don't get to just walk around and call myself an ally to the queer community, right? I can aspire to be an ally, but it's ultimately up to the queer community to determine on any given day, in any given situation, whether or not I'm actually, if they feel supported by me, right? So that's one of the first things. And then the other piece that I just want to add on or layer onto this, because I think that the conversation often can be in this loop around the individual and the individual's responsibility to be an ally. And at the same time, just helping people I want to plant a seed that, yes, you want your colleague next to you, absolutely, to show up as an ally. And ultimately, you want the person who you devote your life's work to, the employers or the people that you serve through your work, to be a broader ally, right? That's something that that's the bare minimum of what we deserve. So I just want to add that layer into it. And also, I know we're going to talk more about organizations in a moment, but I just wanted to frame it that way. And then to the piece around that Michael mentioned around, the fear of getting it wrong, which is a very real fear. I don't want to downplay that. I'll just offer something that my good friend Rachel Wiley says a lot, which is allowing space to fumble and responsibility to repair, right? And so that's the spirit that we need to bring to the relationships that we're building if we want them to be better, stronger, more successful on either end. It's like, we're going to make mistakes, and we have a responsibility to take or I guess I want to say we have to take responsibility for the impact that those mistakes have and repair them when needed, but knowing that's how we further the work, right? So I'll pause there and allow Agatha some space to add.
I just want to come into quickly on what you described, Viva, is just for me, it sounds psychological safety in action. It is how it's lived. Not just words or any descriptions or definitions. That's what it looks like. And that's how you can identify it when you look in your environment. But yeah, Agatha, I wonder your thoughts and reflections.
Yeah, I love a lot of what has been said already. I think one of the things that is definitely standing out to me is the organization's responsibility and allyship. And I know Viva is going to talk about this a little bit in more detail. Or we all will in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But it's just so important to realize that it's not just at that individual and interpersonal level we're talking about psychological safety. We're also talking about it at the environmental and organizational level. And so I think there was a question in the chat, and I'm going to briefly just sort of touch on it a little bit because it's going where I'm going, which is, how do we begin to think about how the organization creates an environment that is psychologically safe for everyone, right? I briefly touched upon, having equity-centered policies and practices in place. And one specific example is having a culture of bystander intervention. Right. And so when people hear bystander intervention, you just think, oh, people speaking up and taking action in defense of the person who was being harmed from, let's say, a microaggression. But bystander intervention culture is not just on the individual or even the team, but it's also on the organization. How is the organization promoting this? How is the organization promoting anonymous reporting of incidents, right? How are managers maybe even evaluating the number of times that team members are speaking up for others or advocating for others in meetings when they notice things? Is that part of how folks are being evaluated in their role, especially for leaders and supervisors, right? It should be an environment where we don't tolerate, right, women being spoken over, right? We get to a culture where it's not so much the direct reports who are constantly having to bring it to the attention of leaders, right? It's leaders actually beginning to model what it looks like to have, sorry, my camera is moving, My webcam's moving around, but leaders being able to model what it looks like to support bystander intervention as an organization, right? So that's one thing I want to touch on there in terms of allyship, is that it's not just, as we've already said already, it's not just on the team or that interpersonal dynamic. It's definitely also on the organization. Like we want the organization to buoy, right? Like to hold up and uphold when we do actually engage in effective allyship. There are a couple other things I can mention too in terms of allyship and that environment, but I'll pause there because I know we have other questions that we want to get to. But yeah.
Indeed, and as always, when you're having great conversation, time is running away with us. But I would love us to get even more practical, and like you hinted, Agatha, have a conversation now or share some insights now with regards to what organizations and individuals can do to increase psychological safety. I know we've started, but let's hear some more concrete suggestions. So Viva, can I kick off with you? What can organizations, individuals do?
Absolutely. First, let me say that the article that Agatha and I wrote is full of far more examples of this. So if you haven't dug into that, we purposefully wanted that to be an article that people come back to again and again and talk about in meetings and use to inform their strategies and things like that. So go back to the article if you haven't had a chance to do that yet. I will just hone in on a couple of things. I mean, Agatha mentioned this, but the first is truly investing in that mindset shift of focusing shifting the focus from the micro of like the individual interactions that we have with people, although important, right, that we're paying attention to that, but really putting the onus on systems, right? So, and this is just because far too often DEI efforts, I'm going to give it to you straight. We're stuck in this loop of listening and learning, listening and learning, listening and learning. How long are we going to be in the cycle of listening and learning without using that to inform actual standards, practices, accountability, which is what Agatha ultimately was getting at. So that mindset shift, I think, is a really critical one in terms of a concrete action. And then I'm going to give it to you again, pretty brass tacks, which one, the next one that I think is really important is like, how can we trust that we are valued in a space, that we are included in a space or celebrated in a space if our paychecks don't match what they need to match in order to demonstrate that? So start paying us, right? Start looking at pay equity and doing a pay audit. This is a very concrete action that people can take within organizations, or if you don't find yourself in a role where you can directly impact that, right? You can continue to raise it with people within your organization, within the HR department there. I'm not going to lie to you. Doing a pay equity audit is work that is messy, that can take years to reconcile and to do, but that really demonstrates a real investment in wanting to make sure that you're an equity-centered organization. So you can't really say that you're committed to equity without where your money goes matching that, right? So those are a couple of the things. And then lastly, this is about real protection. I even saw a question in the chat that relates to this around how do you raise, if you find yourself in a situation, how do you raise that? I mean, I think it's really about making sure that you do have policies that are trauma informed, and then actually adhering to them within the organization and upholding them. So often people will share, this is why there is such a contentious, oftentimes, relationship between, let's say, Black people within an organization or other marginalized groups and an HR department. There's like a distrust because HR should be there to be the moral compass of an organization, but instead we all have had experiences with HR where they are, at the end of the day, pushing the status quo, right? Protecting those in power. So it's about, yes, having the policies, but actually adhering to them and making sure that you are upholding them when somebody's safety is breached, right? And I could talk more about this specific question around how to raise that and how to provide that feedback in a way that has a better chance of being heard. But we don't have as much time to unpack that. But there are ways to do that and at the same time, ultimately, the onus and responsibility is always with those who hold more power in the organization to actually listen and do something about it.
Absolutely, love that. Thank you. There's a lot in there. Agatha, anything else to add?
Yeah, I know in the article like as Viva mentioned, we have a lot in there in terms of recommendations at the organizational level as well as the individual level. I think a big key part of this work is the reflection bit of it, right? So there's a lot of listening and learning that's happening, like Viva mentioned, right? And I wonder if there's enough reflection, like honest reflection happening too, right? And then if there's enough action happening as a result of those reflections. And then after that, are there social accountability systems in place? Do we have a culture of social accountability, right? So there are so many ways I could go with that. And I think one of the things for sure is where we see a lot of microaggressions and situations come up is when we are in a decision-making type of meeting. Sometimes even just routine team meetings, ideas are being, thrown out, right? And not everyone is feeling heard, or there is a different level of interrogation that different people are experiencing when their ideas are pitched, right? So I've definitely experienced it many times and witnessed often where, I will put out an idea, but I already know from historical experience, right? And maybe even at the organization that I need to have a almost bulletproof idea. So it gets a psychological safety again, is that, some folks are pitching ideas not necessarily psychologically safe. They're not pitching it thinking that they might get it wrong or that they feel safe to make a mistake. They're pitching it almost sure and in their mind that it will be accepted, that it will meet the status quo. And so that there's a problem there, right? There's one layer there. But yes, individually, I think the key things are, it's not just listening and learning, it's also reflecting, taking action based on what we've reflected. Why did I not speak up at that time? What were some of my apprehensions and fears? Are they tied to my own professional growth or my social capital within the organization? And then how am I being held accountable by my peers, informally and formally, right? When I don't speak up when something does take place. So I think those are some ways to begin to think about how we cultivate psychological safety at that individual and that team level. And then I'll add one more thing, because I think this is so important. I just want to make sure this is key, and it kind of brings organization and individual together. And it's this thing of empowerment that's so important. And it ties back to the inequity of the use of energy that different people are engaging in when they are at the workplace based on their identity. And I think it's really important that historically and presently marginalized folks have spaces with folks who are having the same experiences as they are based on their identity. So affinity groups, cross affinity groups as well. It's so important because it allows them to share the burden and the energy that they're expending. The power of we is so powerful. There's a lot of research out there about what happens when someone shares a microaggression or something that has happened to them in the workplace with people who look like them, and how that immediately lifts some of that burden and some of that traumatic effect off of them. And of course, this has ripple effects on performance, productivity, and all around team culture. So I think folks who have stood up ERGs, different types of affinity groups, that is a really important move in the lane of empowerment spaces for folks.
Thank you both. Thank you both. a couple of kind of summary comments that come into mind based on what you've shared. Just a reminder for all of us to think both micro to macro. And even when we're thinking, as we're thinking micro to macro, you know, from like personal change to systems change, we need to think about kind of in-depth reflection, like Agatha said, regardless of our, like an in-depth reflection that draws on our different identities. So we need to pay attention to ways in which we have been advantaged or we've had these advantages and how that might have made it easy or difficult to navigate some of the learning. But when we think about macro, I'm also loving the concept of social accountability as well as almost like systemic accountability. So build into your systems these accountability processes, as well as build into the culture these kind of social accountability systems. Love that. We are so over time, not over, but close to time. I just want to maybe pick up on one or two comments in the questions in the chat. And then what we will do is we will ask for key takeaways and then we will round up. So there's a question, and you know, as we're coming to the end of the conversation, and understandably, there's a question around, you know, actually, why do this? Like, what's the point? Does it work? And I certainly want to, you know, uplift. There's a lot of research out there, broadly speaking, that speaks to the value of psychological safety, but particularly for this conversation in terms of paying attention to identity matters. We certainly found in the work that we do, and I'm sure it's the same with Agatha and Viva, where you give permission to think about the different energy levels, like Agatha has said before, the different journeys everyone has had right through here, where it's okay to pay attention to that, then you can, as a group, as a team, as a culture, kind of create these systems and practices that uplift everyone, where you understand that we've all had different journeys to here, but you know what, let's just figure out what the best is for all of us. Then you know, it's that whole expression about the rising tide lifting all boats. You can create a baseline of team practices, and we've seen team practices, team processes benefit from the idea of identity being centered in psychological safety. We've also seen in the work that we do, because phenomenal innovation, because more and more people are like, okay, you see me, you get me, all right, you've created these systems, you've had these social and systemic accountability practices. All right, let me tell you what I really think about ABCD, and the power of that innovation, the power of the contribution of this ideas brings innovation to the space. And we certainly have seen in our coaching with clients after psych safety, in the context of psych safety, where different people who would have left the business are now thinking, you know what, you know, maybe I won't go, maybe I will stay, maybe I'm not going to go out the window, go out the door. And so really want to, you know, really be explicit about that. We are so close to time. And so what I'm going to ask is maybe one key takeaway from everyone. And I am going to start with Viva.
Okay, I'm going to try to move quickly here, but I want to pick up on what you just said, Dr. Doyin, because while it's so important to look at precedent and what has already been achieved when we know that this is happening in higher degrees in certain places over others, and this might be a little bit too heady maybe for a Friday when people are sort of wrapping up, but I want to invite people to think about the fact that there is something, there might be something even better than what any of us has ever seen before when we can invest in this. Like, we haven't even scratched the surface of what might be possible when everyone is operating in a place where they can truly contribute, where they can truly come from a place of you know, dissent when appropriate, right? And the shared collective, first of all, connectedness to each other and humanity. And then secondly, the shared success, right, that could bring. So there's something better out there and we can make it happen, right? And then I will also just say, because it speaks to this question around the UK and the US, and I know we have a pretty international group here with us. And so the thing I'm taking away, we've talked a lot about responsibility of organizations, and I want to say that responsibility must first begin with acknowledgement. And I think that in my work with folks in the UK and family that lives in the UK, right, this is, I think, a determining or a distinctive factor in the conversation. It's like the acknowledgement even doesn't exist, where you can then open the door to a larger conversation. So employers, are unknowingly sort of widening the impact of institutional betrayal by not only skipping out on the work, but denying that the work is even needed in the first place, right? And so I think that's just something that I wanted to flag, and I think that we can maybe unpack that a little bit more in the Q&A if we have time.
Viva. Agatha, over to you. Takeaways.
Yeah, I think one of the main key takeaways is understanding the intersection of worker well-being, right? Being able to bring the fullness of who you are, how that intersects with the work that we do when we say we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's just so important, thinking about the whole person. And then the other thing I want to also invite people into is to understand the importance of community building and coalition building. Those are two different things. And we didn't really dive into that, but there's definitely more of an emphasis for allies, and there's more of an emphasis for folks who experience multiple marginalization at the identity level. So community building is definitely for everyone, but it's most vital for folks who experience marginalization. And coalition building is beneficial for everyone, but it is most important and vital for folks who are aspiring to be effective allies. Because when we're coming together to coalition build, we're not coming together to feel comfortable about speaking up. I have to call that out. We're actually coming together to put our comfort on the back seat and acknowledge the issues that exist and distill the action steps that we are going to take together as a unit, right? And then with community building, I talked a little bit about this before, just the empowerment aspect of it, getting to a place where we have greater agency to decide when and how we want to engage with different people, getting to the same level of agency in interactions, in decision-making, and safety that dominant groups have. That's really the goal of all of this, is so everyone is on an equal level playing field, and we're all able to bring the best of ourselves to the work. And as Viva mentioned, the sky's the limit. We have not seen yet what we can do as a society when everyone is able to freely do this properly in the workplace or show up in this way.
Thank you, Agatha. Love it. Michael.
I'll try and keep it really short. And I'm going to pick up on the things that Viva and Agatha has said. So something better we have not seen yet, and working as a unit. I think I just want to re-emphasize the importance of the organization. So organizations do play an essential part, on the top levels, and then the organization it's a whole, and to lay out, the norms, the values, the behaviors that are acceptable. And now I want to come back to also understanding that every single individual is part of an organization, was part of that system that we find ourselves in. So again, that means every single one of us has a responsibility to take action, be it the organization or on the individual level, to make that, something better what's there, something better that we have yet not seen, and that's only achievable as a unit, as Agatha said. I'll leave it at there.
Leave it there. There's so much more we could go on to, but we're going to have to pull the conversation to a close. Agatha, Viva, Michael, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. We know there are people who've come in from, who are dialing from South Africa, from Brazil, from countries in Europe, from other parts of the UK, from the United States. And one of the things that is implicit in all of the work that we do is, yes, we've focused on the experience of Black women as a starting point for this conversation when we think about identity matters in the context of psychological safety, but of course completely understand, like we heard just now around intersectionality, that in different communities, in different countries, in different contexts, different identities are more marginalized compared to others. So class, sexual orientation, religion, etc. And so we do understand that in your different contexts, you might want to really think through, what does this mean when we think about different identities at the center versus the margin? Thank you everyone for being here today to hear us talk about psychological safety. You know, you can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all of us, 4 of us. To check out the Delta website if you want to hear more about what we're doing for the Psychological Safety Month. We're doing an open webinar with one of our consultants on psychological safety, so you'll get some information on that. You will be delighted to hear that this will be available for recording very, very soon. So if you had to drop off, you will get that. And I just want to close, and then we maybe take a few more minutes for people who are able to stay a bit longer for questions. Luke, thank you so much. Please stop the recording now.